Hello gamers, and welcome to my Path of Radiance unit guide. Since Path of Radiance just released for the NSO, I thought there might be an uptick in new players, so I figured I would release a couple of videos giving my thoughts as a experienced Fire Emblem player on how best to approach this title. This isn't a tier list, I'm not ranking the characters against each other, and as such, I'm not factoring in things like availability or opportunity cost. Instead, I'm trying to convey a general idea of what payoff you would get for investing in specific characters, because Path of Radiance has a lot of units in it, but you don't have enough resources to invest in all of them. And there's a couple of different ways you can invest in characters in this game. Obviously, whoever you choose to deploy and train up is going to get stronger, and that's a form of investment, but Path of Radiance also has bonus experience, skill scrolls, and stat boosters, each of whom you want to divvy out to the best possible units. Truth be told, this is an easy enough game that you can honestly just go with your favorites and be fine, but for anyone who's a little bit nervous about having buyer's remorse, this is to give a general idea of who I think the best targets are, as well as what you can get out of, let's just say, the more unconventional units. I've divided these up into categories: no-brainer, the best investment targets, good investment targets, the people who need a lot of investment, might as well, good enough short-term, memes, and end of the game. And I'm going to go over them in descending order, but once again, this is not a tier list. These aren't tiers, so just because someone is in a lower or higher category than other people doesn't mean I consider them to be a better or worse unit necessarily. I have a tier list on my channel. It's a very old one, so the quality is not great. The audio quality is like a little bit sketchy. And since I posted that video, I have changed my mind on a couple of rankings, but if you want to get a general idea of what I think, I'll link that old tier list down below. For now though, let's dive into the character guide. First up, I have the no-brainer team, and these are the 3 units that I think almost everyone should have on their team, unless you're intentionally trying to make the game harder on yourself. The first is Titania, and she is this game's Jagen, which, in case you're unfamiliar, is a term the Fire Emblem community uses for someone super strong in the early game who falls off as the campaign continues. And I think it's accurate to say Titania falls off, just not to the same extent that other Jagens such as Vander, Gunter, or Marcus do. She starts the game off as easily your strongest character, one-rounding most opponents and taking very little or sometimes even no damage from foes. But as the game goes forward, she's not going to gain stats as quickly as other people because she's promoted, so she levels up slower. Her growth rates are actually still quite good, so if you continue to field her into the mid and late game, Titania will still level up and keep pace with the enemies, but eventually your growth units will catch up and pull ahead of her. And so I like to say that Titania goes from the strongest unit you have to the weakest unit you're willing to field. Because by the end game, Titania will still be much stronger than your bench warmers, but she's not going to be on the same level as some of the more extreme growth units. The second no-brainer, Rayson, is this game's refresher unit. He is a Heron Laguz, which means he transforms between a human form and a bird form. When he's in human form, he functions quite similarly to the dancers from other Fire Emblem games, in that he can give one unit an extra action every turn. But whenever Rayson transforms into his bird form, he is able to refresh 4 units at a time. Simply by clicking the refresh command, anyone standing next to him gets an extra action. And as such, you can kind of think of Rayson as being a +3 units button. He fills a deployment slot, but since he allows 4 people to take an action instead of just 1, he kind of gives you 3 extra actions. At higher level play, there are a ton of other really cool stuff you can do with dancers, but even as a novice, getting 3 extra attacks is just good, and it's pretty hard to screw up using Rayson. He's also required to be deployed in Chapter 19 for a side objective that gets you one of the most powerful accessories in the game, so at the very least I would recommend using him there. But personally, I think Raisin should always be on your team in basically every playthrough. The last unit I have marked down here is Tanith, and she has two major functions she brings to the table. The first is that Tanith herself is just a really strong flying pre-promote who joins about halfway through the game and has the stats to kill most enemies you face. She's bulky enough that she can fight a ton of people on enemy phase, and the fact she has both physical and magical stats means she can choose whether to target defense or resistance based on what the enemy has lower of. But Tanith's phenomenal stats aren't even the only reason you might want to deploy her, because Tanith has unique access to the Reinforce command, and this means 2 times per battle she can summon 3 allied NPCs to fight on your behalf. The NPCs aren't fully controllable, but you can assign them to target specific points, and oftentimes I like to use them as human decoys to lure enemies out of formation. After all, Fire Emblem 9 is a game with permadeath, so if you use any of your characters to lure enemy out of formation, they risk dying forever. But the NPCs will always be able to be called back on every map, so throwing them away as human shields is a valid tactic with no opportunity cost. But even if you're not using human wave tactics, the NPCs are just 6 additional bodies that will help you kill enemies, and that in and of itself is useful for the same reason that Raisin giving you 3 extra actions is. The more people in your army, the more damage you can do to your opponents, and the more damage you do to your opponents, the faster you can kill them. Alright, next up we have the 5 units that I would consider to be the best investment targets. If you choose to give these characters bonus experience, stat boosters, and skills, they can carry you through the majority of the campaign. And they're all good for fairly similar reasons. The 5 of them are mounted units, so they get to take advantage of higher movement and Canto, and their stats are all generally good and well-rounded. They're going to be fast enough to double most enemies, strong enough to one-round them if they double, and bulky enough to survive large onslaughts on enemy phase. Kieran and Oscar, this game's Christmas Cavaliers, are the most straightforward of the bunch, and they function quite similarly. The only major difference is Oscar joins earlier, but Kieran has slightly higher base stats. They'll both be able to put in a good deal of work during the early game, and if you're willing to give them both bonus experience and regular experience, they're probably going to promote in a timely fashion, at which point they can select a second weapon of your choosing. Personally, I like giving Oscar axes since they're the best weapon in the game, but it's worth considering bows on Oscar if you want to take advantage of his triangle attack with Boyd and Rolf. As for Kieran, you can kind of give him whatever weapon you want since he already has axe axis. The third Cavalier, Astrid, is actually pretty different from Kieran and Oscar because she starts out severely underleveled. This means it's difficult for her to secure kills on map, but you can power her up with bonus experience. And because of her skill Paragon, she gains experience at double the rate of everyone else. And this applies to bonus experience as well, meaning that she's one of the more efficient members of the cast to give your BXP to, since it costs less to level her up. Astrid is also in a pretty cool position where she can end up over-leveled and not really suffer, because Paragon still doubles the amount of EXP she gets. Normally when a character is over-leveled, they are going to have a severe drop-off in experience, but Astrid still gains EXP pretty fine, so she can stay ahead of the level curve for most of the campaign. She does definitely need that bonus experience at the beginning of her training arc, but in my opinion, it's worth it. The last 2 characters I consider to be amongst the best investment targets are Marcia and Jill, and these 2 are your early flying units. So, in addition to having the higher move and Canto that the Cavaliers have, Marcia and Jill will also be able to ignore terrain, And the benefits of this can range from extreme cases like flying off of a boat in order to fight over the water, or much more niche applications like flying through a forest and not getting slowed down, since infantry and cavalry take terrain penalties and therefore would have to steer around it. Personally, I think Jill is slightly stronger than Marcia because she leans into strength and defense, whereas Marcia is more of a speedster, and enemies in Path of Radiance tend to be slow enough that even your mid-speed enemies can double everyone. But either or both of these characters are good investment targets, and they will give you a powerful air force if you're willing to give them the resources they want. Next up, we have good investment targets. These characters are a step below the ones I've already mentioned, but they're still going to be a fine return on investment if you want to use them because you like their personalities. And first on this list, I have Makalov, the character whose personality almost no one likes. But Makalov is still a decent unit. He's another one of the Cavaliers, so he has all of the same benefits of Oscar, Kieran, and Astrid in terms of higher move and well-rounded stats. And in fact, when at the same level, all 4 Cavaliers tend to have very similar stats to each other. But the main issue with Makalov is he's almost always going to be the lowest leveled of your Cavaliers. He joins later than Oscar, Kieran, and Astrid, and unlike Astrid, he doesn't have the Paragon skill, so his experience gain is going to be at the normal rate. Cavalry is extremely powerful in Path of Radiance, so if you want more horse boys, Makalov does satisfy that condition, but if you're trying to round out your team to have more than just paladin spam, he's probably the first Cavalier you would consider dropping. Next in this category, we have 3 mages, Soren, Ilyana, and Khalil. Magic is pretty weak in Path of Radiance, and as a result, Mage is one of the worst classes in the game. But Path of Radiance does supply you with a large amount of Siege Tomes, which are able to attack from 3 to 10 range, and as such, you probably want at least 1 Mage on your team to take advantage of these powerful tools. Soren and Ilyana are the 2 early mages you get, and they're quite similar to each other. They have slightly different stat spreads, and each of them has a personal skill, Soren with Adept and Ilyana with Shade, but for the most part, they'll play a similar role of being frail spellcasters that require a good amount of training, either on-map experience or BXP. Where things get interesting is with the 3rd mage I put in this category, Khalil, who I actually think is the best of this trio. Khalil joins as a pre-promoted sage at around the time you start getting siege tomes like Bolting and Meteor. She has the weapon rank for all 3 of them, a trait that's unlikely to be true of Soren or Ilyana, and her stats are gonna be basically on par with any of your training project mages. So she seemingly offers you the payoff of a trained sage without requiring the early game training arc. However, there is a catch. If you trained up Soren or Ilyana, you can give them staves upon promotion, and they can function as both an offensive mage and a support healer. But Khalil does not have staff access. Instead, she has both tomes and knives, and knives are just not a good weapon type. As such, if you're the sort of player who's worried about role compression and wants to have your Staffer and Siege Tomer take up a single deployment slot, then Khalil isn't going to be able to fulfill that need for you. I personally still prefer her because you get a lot of deployment slots in Path of Radiance's late game, but the lack of staff utility means this isn't a situation where one option outclasses the other. It really just comes down to playstyle preference. The last unit I have on here is Boyd, the Axe Fighter, and despite being an infantryman, Boyd does have a few things working in his favor. Axes are the best weapon in the game, and Boyd's strength stat supplements this even further. As an early joiner, Boyd also has a lot of opportunities to train with relatively uncontested experience. But his biggest issue is probably his low accuracy. This can be helped somewhat by removing the Tempest skill, which Boyd starts with, but I think the biggest thing Boyd wants are forges with increased hit. Like all units, Boyd appreciates bonus experience, but I don't think he needs it that badly since he has access to the early game training chapters, which can help him to get the ball rolling. Next up, I've got a group of characters who I've labeled needs lots of investment, and we're starting with the dynamic duo Mia and Zehark, each of whom are sword-locked infantry. Swords are the second worst weapon type in Path of Radiance, right behind bows, and being an infantry is worse than being on a horse. So right away, these two have some pretty strong demerits. Additionally, each of them specializes in speed, and their speed stat tends to be overkill, as other characters can often double enemies with a lower speed stat. This is unfortunate because in exchange for their high speed, Mia and Zehark have pretty bad strength stats, and since they're already using a low might weapon, they can struggle to output damage even while doubling. As such, if you would like either of them to be a functional part of your team, you're going to want to give them a lot of bonus experience. Pushing them ahead of the level curve is the best way to ensure they still deal a reasonable amount of damage. Although, they also appreciate any forges, especially those with plus might, or once they're promoted, potentially plus crit. I'm personally not a fan of crit strats, but if you're using Swordmasters, that's probably what you're using them for, right? In addition to the Myrmidons, I have Gotri and Nephany, each of whom are lance infantry, but they actually face pretty different struggles from each other. Gotri has decent stats for his join time, especially when it comes to bulk, as he's going to be shrugging off physical attacks like nobody's business. The biggest thing that holds him back, instead, is the armored class. They are tied with mages for having the lowest movement in the game, and mages have 1-2 range alongside siege tomes to make up for their low movement. Armors mostly lack these tools. They do have javelin access, which is nice, but so does like 90% of the cast, so it's not the biggest deal in the world. Because his struggles are tied to his class line, Gotri asks for a weird form of investment. Instead of desperately wanting BXP or stat boosters, Gotri would prefer that you commit horse units to ferrying him around the battlefield with the rescue command. This means at certain points in the map, 2 units are going to need to sacrifice their turns just to lug Gotri around, which is a pretty significant inconvenience, and I don't think his stats are high enough to justify it, but if you like his personality, it's definitely something you can consider. Nephany, on the other hand, starts incredibly underleveled, and her stats reflect this. As such, much like Makalov and Astrid, she needs a significant amount of either babying or bonus experience. Her growths are stacked in such a way that Nephany will have stats pretty close to Marcia if they're the same level, but she starts in more of a hole and she doesn't offer flight as a payoff. So babying her definitely is a less appealing proposition, at least to me. That being said, Nephany does have a pretty powerful skill at her disposal, Wrath, which makes it so you have plus 50% to your crit rate whenever you're at half HP or lower. As such, outside of the bonus experience or babying, to get her full potential, Nephany really appreciates some specific tools. Either bulk boosting stat boosters like the Angelic Robe and Draco Shield, or skill scrolls that synergize with the Wrath skill, specifically Vantage to allow her to crit before the enemy can strike, or Resolve, which boosts strength, speed, and skill when at 50% HP or less, allowing Nephany to get 2 boosts when her health is low. Unfortunately, the payoff is still a little bit too lackluster and inconsistent for my taste, but Nephany is undeniably a fun unit if you're willing to go the extra mile and give her the resources she so desperately desires. The last unit I have in this category is Tormod, and he's the 3rd mage you get, although similarly to Astrid and Makalov being behind the other Cavaliers, Tormod is usually going to be a lower level than a trained Sorin or Ilyana, and as such, he doesn't have a huge appeal to investing in him. Although there is one unique attribute he possesses. He has the Celerity skill, which grants plus 2 movement. And since Mage's default move is tied with Armor Knights, the extra move from Celerity does help Tormod to navigate the battlefield a little bit quicker than his competition. So if that sounds appealing to you, giving him bonus experience at his join time is gonna get him on par with the rest of your army and let him take over from there. The next category I have is called Might as Well. And this is a collection of units, each of whom has a unique attribute, making it so that you probably want to invest in them regardless of how good or bad they are as a unit. And the first of these is Ike, the game's main lord. For most of the campaign, Ike is actually a pretty underpowered character. Much like Mia and Zehark, he suffers from being sword-locked and infantry. But he also has a story promotion at the end of Chapter 17, meaning that he'll be stuck at level 20 for at least some amount of the early to mid-game if you bother training him up. But despite this, you probably still want to at the very least give him some levels, because Ike is force deployed on every single map in the game, so it feels like a waste to not get use out of him as a combat unit. Additionally, for the last 2.5 chapters of the campaign, Ike gets access to Ragnell, a very powerful infinite durability 1-2 range sword. And with Ragnell, he can sweep through foes at a pretty drastic rate, as it not only has a super high might, but also buffs Ike's defenses. And because of Ragnell, Ike is practically required to defeat the final boss, as there are only 5 other characters who can damage the final boss, and you're only able to get 2 of them in a single playthrough. And even before the final boss, Ike participates in a duel to the death with one of the game's major antagonists, the Black Knight. This duel can be pretty RNG dependent, and you have the option to flee, which I personally would recommend most players do, as the reward isn't really worth it. But if you're invested in the story and want to take revenge on this antagonist for all the evil he's done throughout the narrative, then investing in Ike is the only way you're able to defeat him unless you play the sequel, Radiant Dawn. In terms of how you invest in Ike, you could always give him bonus experience, but he also has access to the Aether skill, which is a powerful mastery skill that allows him to strike twice, triggering both Soul and Luna. Although, if you're concerned about the duel with the final boss of the game, saving the Wrath and Resolve skills for Ike is generally considered to be the best way to tackle that fight, as the other units capable of damaging him are a lot more questionable, such as Enna, who I also put in Might as Well because she's a unit that can damage the final boss, but she starts out quite underpowered, and you have 1.5 chapters to train her up before the confrontation. If you do not have confidence in Ike's ability to solo the final boss, training up Enna is the best way to have a backup plan. And since she joins so close to the end of the game, you probably have a ton of accumulated bonus experience you can just dump onto her. It's not like the hugest thing in the world, but I mean, you might as well, which that's the name of the tier. Speaking of which, the next 3 characters, Riss, Mist, and Alincia, are the game's only dedicated healers, and so in most playthroughs you're going to want to invest in at least one of them. They have slight differences between them. Riss has the highest magic out of all characters in the game, but much like the mages, he is stuck on armor movement. In contrast, Mist has the lowest magic of your potential healers, but upon promotion she gets a horse, and so she has all of the benefits of higher move and Canto. And Canto is especially appreciated because as a frail healer, she doesn't want to stay by the front lines. With Canto, she can go forward, heal an ally, and then retreat to the back lines out of danger. And this same principle applies to Alincia, who is a flying staffer. However, Alincia's main problem is she joins very late into the campaign. Not only that, but her combat stats are abysmal, so she really is just in here for healing, which is not going to be true of either Riss or Mist if you promoted them. Still, Stabs on a Flyer is a unique and powerful bit of utility, and as I said earlier, Path of Radiance gives you a lot of deployment slots. So you might as well use Alincia and potentially even give her some BXP to help boost that healing potential. The next 2 characters, Mordecai and Warum, are in this category because they want a unique piece of investment that no one else benefits from, the Statue Frag, which is a stat booster that increases a unit's weight. Weight is really only used for calculations around rescuing and shoving. And if either of these tigers are given both of the game's statue frags, they're capable of shoving Jill, the wyvern, which can be really nice for enabling strategies that require long movement in a single turn. Of course, there are only 2 statue frags in the game, so you're gonna have to pick one of the tigers to invest in, and Mordecai has the Smite skill, which allows him to shove 2 tiles instead of 1, so he's probably the better choice, but in an Iron Man situation, or if you just don't like Mordecai's personality, Muaram can also fulfill this task, and eventually you get a scroll that grants the Smite skill, so at that point they become functionally identical. Lastly, we have Volk, one of the game's 2 thieves. I briefly considered including the game's other thief, Soth, in this category as well, but given his low bases as well as the focus on Blossom combat, I didn't want to give people the wrong impression. The main reason Volk is here is to open doors and chests, as well as steal unequipped items from foes. And it's that second piece of utility that potentially requires investment. If there's a specific enemy you want to steal from, giving Volk bonus experience to push his strength or speed over the required steal thresholds is honestly a fair use of investment. Personally, one thing that I like to do is give Volk an extra point of strength so he can steal the Laguz Slayer in Chapter 11. But there are sure to be plenty of other times in your playthrough where investing in Volk will have some sort of minor benefit for you, so you might as well give him that bonus experience. Okay, we're gonna blitz through these last 2 categories because there's not much to say about these units. Anyone in good enough short term is basically self-explanatory. There's gonna be a couple of chapters where their bases hold up, and so you can use them on your team without necessarily investing in them. Leth is the perfect example of this, as at the point she joins you, her stats are gonna be ahead of the curve for anyone you haven't given a ton of bonus experience. And she has 9 movement, so she can keep up with your horse mounts. But as the game goes on and you get more powerful units, Leth doesn't really hold up, as her slow experience gain, along with the clunky Laguz mechanics, means she's usually not worth a slot. Devdon has filler stats and joins directly before Chapter 17, where you're going to have a lot of empty deploy slots, so he's probably making the cut for one of those chapters. And Stefan is in a similar situation, but his base stats are actually kind of ridiculous, so there's a justification to bring him later in the game if you want. Janef and Ulki are not particularly stellar for the time they join in Chapter 18, but one of them is required for a side objective in Chapter 19, so using them, at least on that map, is generally kind of advisable. Taronio has decent stats and the best skill in the game, Resolve, but he's stuck in the general class, so he's going to be on low movement. Still, you've got a lot of slots late game, so sometimes you can find room for him. And Joffrey is a paladin that comes for free, and usually can carry himself to endgame on the pure power of his bases. This is also true to a lesser extent of Har, who is a late joining wyvern, although his bases are considerably shakier, especially his speed stat. Lastly, I have Bastion, who's basically just a worse version of Khalil since he joins so much later, but if you want another Siege Tome user, he can use all of them. Starting off the meme category, we have Shannon and Rolf, each of whom are bow-locked units with tragic stats for their join time. Archer is already a bad class, so having underwhelming stats to go along with it is just the biggest tragedy in the world. Although Shannon does at least get to shine during 3 early game chapters, where he is available before he leaves for the majority of the campaign, and by the time he comes back, his stats suck. Ranulf, similarly, just offers too little too late. He's another cat in a similar position to Laith, but you've got far more powerful people in your army by the time he joins. Lucia is a swordmaster, and when she joins, she's gonna have worse stats than not only Stefan, but also a trained Zihark or Mia, so she's truly tragic. Braum, similarly, isn't a bad class, Armor Knight, and compares poorly to Gotri, who joins only 2 chapters after him. Largo is a berserker with pretty good strength and speed, but pitiful defenses, and he can often find himself getting two-rounded by enemies on his join map, which is just not where you want to be. Especially since his high HP pool means it's hard for your staffers to give him a full heal, and as a result, he can sometimes die even after getting healed up. And the last meme of the game is Soth, and he's a thief just like Volk, but his lower strength and speed means that he's almost always going to be unable to steal most weapons and items from foes. He might be worth deploying on maps with a lot of treasure chests, such as Chapter 12 or Chapter 21, but personally, I've never really felt the need for him. I think Volk can handle most lockpicking duty on his own. The last group I have labeled End of the Game, and in it I put Nasir, Tabarn, Nesala, and Gifka. These are the other 4 characters capable of dealing damage to the final boss, but unlike Enna, they join with almost capped level and incredibly high stats, so there's not really a need for investment or training arcs. In fact, Tabarn, Nesala, and Gifka literally join on the final map, so you can't train them up unless you go out of your way to give capped units a training arc on the final map, which is just kind of ridiculous. Still, if you have one of them on your team, they are going to be helpful against the final boss, so there's no reason not to use them when the time comes. But that's all of the characters in the cast of Path of Radiance. I want to emphasize that even the units I've labeled as memes, short-term, or needing a ton of investment are absolutely capable of being used throughout the entirety of the game if you just really jive with their personality or portrait or anything else about them as a character or unit. Path of Radiance is a really easy game, and even on harder Fire Emblems, taking bad units on your team is more than acceptable, so don't feel like you need to stick to this strictly in any way, shape, or form. I just wanted it to be a helpful resource to anyone paralyzed with indecision. If you're playing through Path of Radiance, either for the first or 15th time, let me know what your team looks like and how they're turning out, as well as what you've invested in them. I'm always curious to see how other people approach this campaign. But that about wraps it up for this video, so it's time to thank my patrons. Thank you, Glupshido, Erica Ford, Perg Knight, YLO1, George Grenville the 7th PM, Jamie Collins, Arvis, Crispy Matthews, Floahay, Amy Hazel, Hungry Heart, Hound Dogs, Lovis Roman, Cynthia, Faulty Videos, Kyle Madison, Derek Williams, Anna Cabana, The Daily Fugle, Faye, Magic Bite, Thoughtful Insanity, Robin Goodfeller, JT Spritter, Ziggy WSB, Dysike, Chris, Root Beer Pants, Queen Elizam, Controlled Ages, Roman Karmansic, Nick Knack, Hammersmack, Carrier Has Left, Angel Not Caceres, Zanwif, Not Gino, Flingon, Edward C, Cyrockin2, Cabbage, SUP, Caius Cole, Bree, Punchfighter Champion, Eggman, Maxine the Vampire Queen, Dragonback Lancer, Sardonic Muse, Zero Gamer, EVVVVVVVV, Femtal Illness, Wannabe Cinnabon, Punk Tattoo Guy, Key the Iron Idol, Calamity Callie, Jackson McMahon, Saren Gurlixy, Rezi, Andu, Rhea, Gameboo, Corrosive, Fire It, Your Doctor, Frozenhelm, Patwit, KH, Electric, Giga, Girl Boss, Lizard, Bongwater, Christopher Bueno, Marin McLean, Jaden, Dylan Solis, Some Trades, Squeegee555, Smaz Ruby, Zycrom, Robin D, Alenby, They Thom, Klon, and Pillow Willow, and especially my Jagans, Your Best Friend 9000, Adele, Alexander Roper, Sensitive Luigi, Siggy, Lil Man, and KTRRK2. If you're interested in joining the names on this list, there is a link to my Patreon below, but please only donate if you can comfortably afford to do so. Regardless of what you choose to do though, I hope you have a wonderful day. Stay safe, gamers.